Hey guys, welcome to part 2 in our series where we read paranormal stories and experiences that are shared on Reddit.
I'm looking forward to another part here, so let's dive in.
All right, this person wrote, woke up at 1 in the middle of the night to a man standing next to the bed staring at my significant other. He was slightly translucent and I figured it was just another sleep paralysis episode. Had them before, so I knew the drill. And I rolled over and went back to sleep. Normally, being able to move isn't part of the sleep paralysis, and immediately my heart began to race as I realized I need to roll over and check what I saw. The person was still standing there staring at my significant other, and then he made eye contact with me, stared at me for a while before turning around and walking to the wall, slowly fading away with each step. Next morning, my significant other wakes up looking like shit and said she had the worst night's sleep because she kept having the feeling that someone was watching her. Glad we no longer live in that house.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many stories like this, Trang. Don't we get a lot of these types of stories?
Oh yeah, like I think on our website, the post we talked about shadow people, shadow persons. That's one of the posts that get probably the most comments, and sounds kind of similar to that. But then, it's one of those things, like even on our blog we were saying, you can protect yourself or just know that they are not bad things, maybe. Or it's more like feel it out. If it's like a person where you're like a spirit that you're like, oh, I didn't feel much from it, so it's probably just lingering around. But I think a lot of times they do look kind of scary, so people are freaked out.
Yeah, that, like you said, Trang, the feeling of it is what's most important. Of course, sometimes we can't help but be afraid, even if it's not really that scary, just because it's like, what is it doing here? But if you genuinely get that like fight or flight survival response, like there's something in you that feels dark, like think of things like in real life, real like day-to-day life, where you have a feeling someone's a bad person, or something's wrong with a certain area you're in. You get that gut punch. If you get that kind of feeling, then it might be something kind of negative. Now, just to be kind of like a quick little clarification here, because people make assumptions about these shadow things. They think, oh my gosh, it's a demon, or they think it's some sort of evil entity, or it's a not crossed over spirit, or it's an alien, or whatever. It truly could be anything. These shadow type beings are not all the same things. There's like the Hat Man, which seems to be a particular type of entity probably. Then there's just generic different kinds of shadow beings that could be literally anything. But don't make any assumptions that it's evil because it's kind of ambiguous looking, or because it's scary or different looking. Pay attention to how you feel. And yeah, sometimes like we live in I've used this term in a previous part of the series, but we have these very multidimensional aspects of ourselves. We are multidimensional. So when we're in a state of sleep, we're kind of drifting out of our body. Our consciousness is kind of going to maybe different dimensions, or it's kind of hovering nearby, and we might kind of have this ability to see things coming from other dimensions a little more clearly. So that's why when you kind of fully wake up, they might be gone, or you might not see them anymore. But yeah, we call them interlopers, like beings that are just kind of dropping by. They're just curious, they're just drifting through. Doesn't mean they're really there for us necessarily, but if this keeps happening, then yeah, something might be attached to the house if it's the same thing that keeps showing up. But we talk a lot about this, about all the different kinds of things it could be on our blog, on our TikToks, at the Happy Healing Shop and Medium Maria Hill, because like we get this question a lot.
All right, so this person writes, night before Thanksgiving 3 years ago, I was across the country at my parents', driving back to theirs with my now wife from a friend's house. As we draw near, there's some type of bundle in the middle of the road. I stopped and pulled off to move it, and turns out to be a barred owl that got clipped by a car. Long story short, I spent the rest of that night getting the owl into a puppy cage, gave it some food and water, and the next day dropped it off at a wildlife rescue center. I got home the next week, all the way across the country, so it's from New Jersey to Oregon. I stepped outside and there was a barred owl sitting on my fence watching me. It was gone by the time I got back, but now I know I'm straight with all owls.
Oh my God. Oh, wow. That's pretty like a profound experience. It's almost like one of those situations where you have to wonder, like, is it their animal guide of some sort, or a being that is in the form of an animal temporarily, or there to teach a lesson, and it was like, you passed, you have completed the lesson, thank you. Maybe this person has a past life connection with these animals that they don't remember, and there's almost like this little spiritual connection. People claim to have connections with all kinds of animals and beings, and plants and all that, and some people are just very naturally attuned to these things, and they have a lot of earth spirits around them, nature spirits, earth spirits. They go by many names. Some people call them, there's different groups of them. There's like the Fae, and there's like little like gnome type beings. Some people call them leprechauns, like these little beings that help preserve nature and all that. So sometimes people have more of these beings around them, and they'll be like maybe pointing them in that direction, like, oh, this animal needs help, make them notice it. And then perhaps when they move across the country, it's almost like an energetic thing, like word gets out energetically and the owl is coming back or is guided to come back. There's a lot of different depth behind this, or this could be, but these are just some theories here.
This person writes, not scary, but still not explainable. When I was 22, I visited my grandma in her retirement home at Christmas. She was well, nothing out of the ordinary. A few days later, I traveled to my then boyfriend across the country. 2 days after New Year's, I woke up at 2 a.m. crying, and I just couldn't stop. I wasn't really sad or overly emotional, but the tears just kept streaming down my face. Nothing like that ever happened, and I was kind of confused, as was my boyfriend. I fell asleep a few hours later. 3 days later, I was informed that my grandma had died that night at about 2 a.m. Due to the divorce of my parents, communication was difficult, and we were only informed after the funeral. I don't believe in anything supernatural, but it's hard to wrap my head around, especially since nothing like this ever happened again.
Yeah, this person was, people always ask me, like, they think clairvoyance is like the pinnacle of psychic abilities, which is just not. It's just a psychic ability. And some people get hung up on the idea that you have to see it or have a vision that something's going to happen in order to be able to see the future, to know the future. And this is a perfect example of an ability like psychic feeling or clairsentience. Clear feeling is actually the real the translation of that. And they felt that something was going to happen before they even understood what that feeling was. And honestly, I always tell people, if the feeling is the most important thing you want to pay attention to, it's our guiding force, and it taps into our most primitive kind of sensory, I don't know if it's like a nervous system thing or what, but it taps into these like primitive sensors almost that can give us a lot of information. And the more we learn to connect with it, the more high definition it gets. But yeah, you don't have to have some sort of dream or vision to know something's going to happen. You could literally feel it, like in this case.
All right, this person writes, many years ago, my parents had separated, and my father was planning to take a trip across the country to California. He was pretty excited about it. I talked to him the day before he's leaving, wish him well, and tell him I'll talk to him after he gets to California. The day of his trip, he calls me and tells me he decided last minute not to go. Refuses to really get into why, just says he changed his mind. Seemed really odd for something that he had been planning for a couple of months. That night, I'm sitting at my girlfriend's house and we are watching the news. They report that US Air Flight 1493, the flight my dad was supposed to be on, collided with another aircraft while landing in LA. About 25% of the people on that flight were killed. Hard to know how my dad would have made out because it really depended on where you were sitting, the front versus the back of the plane. It was several months before he finally told me that night, before he was supposed to leave, he had an extremely vivid dream that he died in a fiery plane crash. So vivid that it scared him out of flying that day. My dad is a Marine Corps Vietnam veteran who saw combat. I can only imagine how vivid the dream must have been to scare him out of getting on the plane that morning.
Damn. This is like another example of, hey, it's not your time, guy. We're gonna protect you. And it's sad. People are gonna be like, well, that's so messed up. Why didn't everyone else have to die? And that requires a deeper conversation that we'll probably have on or have had on other videos, because it's such a deep topic. But there is like a clock for each of us that we have agreed to be in this earth for a certain amount of time and have a certain amount of experiences before we pass. And that's something that we have ourselves chosen. And part of that is also, wrapped up in things that we have to accomplish to counterbalance out. You could call it karmas, but not as a punishment, but just energetic balance, soul balance. So in this case, it was not his time. So he was given that insight, and you could see this exact basically thing happened to many people actually on 9/11, where people like always went to work. They never missed a day. And then suddenly they're like, oh, I can't go in. I just can't explain why. And they just didn't. And they had a lot of guilt after, but it wasn't meant for that experience, wasn't necessarily meant for them in that way. And it seems cruel, but when we understand things in a much more, bigger way, cosmic way, whatever you want to call it, it starts to make a little more sense, but it takes time to kind of process that. So you can have protective type premonitions, and maybe this person never had a premonition before. Maybe that was part of the reason why it was so crazy to them, because it was something they never experienced. It grabs your attention. Like, imagine not having a body and trying to tell someone something's going to happen to them. You're going to use these kinds of tools like dreams and coincidences and things to help with that. What do you think, Trang?
So I know some people might be like, oh, is it all destiny? Are we fated to die a certain time frame? But there's also a lot of free will, and this is a perfect example. There are plenty of people in this world that get subtle signs, but they're so subtle sometimes that a lot of people just wave them off, like, oh, I got a premonition dream, but maybe that's because I'm just subconsciously worried, and I could just see their side being like, no, we're trying to warn you. But again, that's where you can choose your free will to be like, I'm gonna ignore it, or be like, you know what, I'm just gonna play it on the safe side. And I know people, if they shared like, oh, I had a nightmare about the airplane going down in flames, I know like a lot of times you get people would be like, all right, dude, like calm down, it's fine, So it, sometimes you don't want to say that to the public because you might be seen as like crazy or overly paranoid, especially because it is common to have a fear of flying, so that's where I think this is a great example of like even though you talked about the when it's your time to go, you're gonna go, but there are many the big factor here is also free will. Like, he could have gone on that plane if he wanted to, and who knows if he survived or not. So that's just something for anyone watching in to keep in mind.
Yeah, it could have been too, like if he got on the plane, he would have survived, but would have gone through an ordeal. Like there's just these things where if it's not your time, there'll be an interference. Like they try several times sometimes. So let's say maybe he would have gotten explosive diarrhea before he got on the airplane. Instead, if he tried to still get on the plane, maybe that's the next line of defense, like make him so ill he can't fly, right? So there's still other chances if it's really, really not your time. Yeah.
This person writes, early in my now wife and our relationship, I had a dream about her in childbirth, very vivid and long. Like I spent days in the hospital with her and everything was in a strange twilight. When it came time to deliver things went very wrong and she and the baby ended up passing away. I woke up quite shook naturally, but brushed it off. I am a nurse and have to deal with traumatic OB situations before, and I chalked it up to me dealing with that stress through a dream. 6 years later, and my wife is pregnant. I have forgotten the dream by now. I get a call late into the 3rd trimester while I am on shift. Wife is going to ER for a bad BP. I don't know what that means. I get off my shift and go to meet her. As soon as I step into the room, I remember that dream. It's the same damn room, which is extra spooky because the hospital we were at wasn't even built when I had the dream. This is last year, right when lockdown started. My wife is admitted. They want to wait a week to deliver if possible. She will be kept in a twilight state until that time. So it's me in this room, eerily isolated as the world around us is frozen and my wife is incoherent a few feet away. Lingering for days in this room, I brushed off my dream, trying to manage my anxiety and stress. Come showtime, my wife gets ready to begin pushing, and it's exactly the same scenario as my dream. Things start to go poorly, but the doctor thinks delivery is still possible. But at this point, I finally freak out in full panic, and I demand a C-section for my wife. The doctor, I can tell, wants to argue, but I think my outburst made her step back and reassess the situation, and she made the call for emergency C-section. Took 10 minutes for me to get taken back. As I'm in the OR, I see my baby come out lifeless. They do everything they can to manage and resuscitate her. In the meantime, my wife is doing poorly and they are scrambling to control her bleeding. I follow the baby out knowing there's really nothing I can do. Baby gets life flighted to another hospital, but before we go, I see my wife stable and headed to the ICU. Both my wife and baby are critical but alive. Today, they are both thriving, and my baby is 16 months old and just a tornado of energy. I don't know that they would be alive if not for that dream and it causing me to freak out and demand a change in plan.
Wow. How do you feel, Trang?
I mean, even the fact that it was a vivid dream, but it was 6 years later, and he walks into the room. He's like, "It's the same exact room," you know. And the hospital hadn't been built yet when he had that dream, and that, I think those are signs where I think the guy, or maybe it could be a girl, but it's the partner, was probably like, "Oh my goodness, I think this is it. It's all flooding back to me now," and that's what's tripping me out.
Damn, that must have felt like a dream inside of a dream, because he's experienced it while also remembering the dream. And it was interesting because he said the wife was in a twilight state, and it's almost like in the dream he could feel that twilight state, the way he was describing it, like maybe he was kind of empathetically experiencing her. But one little decision, it was a big decision, but one decision was the difference between life and death. And it does make you realize too, right, that time is not linear, and it was implanted, even though that hospital wasn't built yet. How was it possible for him to have known that, right? 6 years apart from when it happened. And it's just, that meant that has already happened theoretically in one reality or something. And that data was brought back to prevent that. And who knows really why this happens, you know, in this way, but there's so many ways it could happen. But what's more crazy than getting a premonition and then being in the situation and it all coming back to you? He must have felt so overwhelmed. And I wonder how many of you have had any similar type story, because I've heard a lot of premonitions that have saved people. Crazy.
Yeah, totally. I can see how people would normally dismiss it by saying like, "Oh, you know, you work in the hospital, it's stress, you see this all the time, so it's natural that it's projecting onto your own situation." So that's where it could get tricky, where people be like, "Oh, I think you're overthinking it," and you're like, "No, this feels," again, the feeling, it feels off, or like, or again, like, I think for me, if I were him or her, I'm just seeing that same exact room, that would probably freak me out. I'd be like, "Okay, I think this is a premonition."
That's just, I can't even. That's crazy.
Okay, this person writes, "There's a story from when I was about 4 to 5 years old. My grandmother was looking through old family photos and asking me who the people were. We got to a picture of my grandfather and she asked me who he was. And I said, Poppy Jim. He died suddenly at home when my mom was 10. So in the same house we lived in. So I never met him. She asked me how I knew that. I told her, oh, he comes and tucks me in and tells me he loves me sometimes after you go to bed."
Oh, that's so freaking cute. Don't you love how candid kids are? Like, they don't have any awareness yet, that age, that there's anything weird or odd. They're just like, yeah, he just comes over, because they don't understand, you know, science and physics and all that. And it's beautiful. And I wish we retained more of that, you know?
Yeah, I think, we kind of talked a bit about in our blog about psychic children, but when they're young, you know, they're still seeing things, exploring things, or feeling things in the world, or the parents usually haven't crushed them yet. Not crushed them, but saying like, oh, it's just your imaginary friend, or like, you know, no, this is the real world, you know, you can't do that anymore, you know. So I think it's just really sweet, the fact that and probably grandpa is just like, hello buddy, you know. It's just a really sweet story. And anyone that's like asking, how can I support my kids, or I feel like my kids are seeing things, you know, make sure to check out our blog. I know we keep mentioning it, but we have so much information, good stuff there, where we talk about, like Maria talks about, signs that your kid might be psychic or gifted, and also what you can do to support them, because that's the best thing you can do as they're growing and developing these abilities, instead of shutting them down out of fear, which I think is what the older generation did to us. But I feel like the newer generation, we're just becoming more accepting of these things. So, yeah.
Yes, thank goodness.
All right. So this person writes, when I was going to my family's home, I got in an SUV going down the road. This was in Bangladesh at the time. And after taking the SUV, the next 2 hours would be a highway going down a forest. I was sitting shotgun along the highway. There was an old man walking down the highway. He was hitchhiking, and the driver decided to pick him up. So the hitchhiker insisted sitting in my seat, and I obliged, as he was an older man. About an hour down the drive, our car collided with a bus and the shotgun seat was mangled up. We all got out and we all looked around, but we couldn't find the old man that insisted on taking my seat anywhere. Stories like this aren't rare, but I didn't believe them. We all know the man sat in my seat and we all saw him, but he was nowhere to be found. He just vanished. No blood. He was wearing ethnic attire, which isn't peculiar around that area. He didn't speak at all, and we didn't ask him anything either. He just said to drop him off at the market ahead, which would be in the town my house was in. One thing that was weird was that he spoke in old-ish Bengali, like an old Bengali that we'd see in poetry from 1800s. I didn't see it as peculiar because he seemed like a ascetic, and he didn't say anything other than he wanted to go and insisted on my seat.
Wow, that sounds like something in like, I don't know, a show or something, like a television show. That's
Totally.
Oh my God. So, there could be several things. And one of the things that came to mind, which I wasn't expecting, is that perhaps that there are guardian spirits of certain areas, that they offer to, come by and help, just, I don't know, help with that area. Perhaps it was an ancestor that, was coming in to help. And perhaps it could have been something like an angelic type being that disguised itself just, for a little bit to do that. Or even a family member, they could change form. But you hear stories like this and it's just so remarkable. I would love to hear like a collection of these. That's a really cool one. But wow, how the balance is so close between life and death, isn't it?
Yeah, I just wonder if it's also like you said, like could be a guardian angel, Archangel Michael, someone, but they don't always have to be the person that, like, imagine if someone with wings was standing on the side of the shoulder road, like and you're like, no, I don't know if I want to pick you up as a hitchhiker. You kind of like, unless it's like a Halloween party or something like that. But so I just wonder, like, if they, sometimes they have to come in forms where it seems like more acceptable or inviting to our eyes. Like an old man, he's not going to harm us. Sure, he really wants to sit in the front seat. Okay.
That's right. And you respect your elders, right? So they're like, okay, he wants to sit in the front, let him sit in the front. So wow.
Right, this person writes, I was driving home from work after picking up my baby late at night. Not many cars around out on the country roads. The one stoplight out there was red for me, so I stopped. It turns green, and I have a sudden voice or thought or whatever in my head saying, don't go yet. Nothing is coming. I'm still sitting at the green light. Right as I let off the brake, a semi truck comes flying through the red light. I was shook. I had a coworker or colleague that had something similar to this too, where this is where it's like clairaudience, which is the psychic gift of hearing. And sometimes you'll get, especially in like these life or death situations, like a spurt. And not everyone has this gift, and that's totally fine if you don't. But she was about to cross the street because she had the walking man sign, and she heard a voice that just calmly said, stop. And she looked around and there was no one around at all. And then a truck like flew past the red light. And as he flew past the red light, he looked at her and his mouth was wide open because he realized at that moment, I think, like, if she had gone, he would have killed her. So.
Oh my God. Yes, there's these you said clairaudience, clairaudience.
Sorry, wrong one. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, wow, what did she taste before that happened? I'm sorry, smell. We're getting all mixed up. So, which that could happen. But the clairaudient phenomenon, when you hear a voice, you hear that a lot. People just report this. And it could be a guide, could be an angel, could be a family member, ancestor, could be anybody who's assigned to work with you or is attached to you in some way. And amongst metaphysical phenomenon, this is I feel like one of the most common is having a near-death experience where someone says something in your psychic hearing. So pretty crazy.
Okay, and that does it for today's video. Don't forget again to like and subscribe down below so you know when the next video is going to come out. And don't forget to join our newsletter where we'll notify you when our Patreon or membership program is launched. That way you get a chance to chit chat with psychic medium Maria Hill and ask away all the questions that you like to.
Don't forget to keep a lookout for the next parts of these series, and we'll see you then.